I have kept records for the imperial household of Dora IV for 31 years. In that time I have logged the births of 3 heirs, the deaths of 2 consorts, the signing of 14 treaties, and the quiet disgrace of 9 ministers who believed their private correspondence was genuinely private. I am Sovin Varath, senior chamberlain of the Oriath Palace, and it is my function, my entire function, to notice things and write them down accurately. I mention this because what I am about to set down is undignified. It involves a human. It involves a small boy sitting on a garden wall. It involves a conversation so ordinary that I am still, 3 years later, slightly embarrassed that it worked when nothing else did. But it did work. And a chamberlain who elects to omit the undignified facts from the record is not a chamberlain. He is a propagandist. I have no interest in propaganda. I have an interest in the truth, however flat and inconvenient it sits on the page. So the facts. The Emperor's son. I will call him the young heir, as court protocol requires when logging events prior to the formal name ceremony, was 7 years of age in the 43rd year of His Majesty's reign, which is the year these events took place. He was a small boy, fine-boned in the way of the Dorath imperial line, with his mother's wide pale eyes and his father's habit of going very still when he was thinking hard. He had been, by all accounts I gathered in the weeks prior to the crisis, a reasonably happy child, curious, occasionally stubborn, fond of the mechanical display cases in the East Gallery, and possessed of an almost alarming attachment to a cloth model of a skyrunner that had one wing and most of its tail in some nursery catastrophe no one could precisely date. In the 38th day of that same year, the young heir stopped sleeping. Not entirely, of course. Children sleep whether they intend to or not, but what sleep came was broken, shallow, shot through with distress that woke the night attendants twice and sometimes 3 times before the 3rd bell. He ate poorly. He spoke less. He sat in the East Gallery for long stretches, staring at the mechanical cases without really watching them, and when the Empress, his mother, who was my second most demanding responsibility, and whom I regarded with a complicated admixture of professional respect and genuine affection, when she sat beside him and asked what was troubling him, he would say, nothing. He would say it the way children say nothing when everything is the matter, but they cannot find the door into the words. The Empress reported this to the Emperor on the 41st day. The Emperor, a composed man, not given to visible distress, a father first when it came to his children, summoned the palace's chief medical officer, a Dorath physician named Helver Sen, on the 42nd day and told him to determine what was wrong with the boy. I was in the room. I am always in the room. It is my job to be in the room. I noted that the Emperor's voice was level, and that his hands, clasped behind his back, were not. Helvar Sen was a competent physician by every standard the Empire possessed. He had trained at the Oriath Medical Academy, completed a secondary certification at the Veth Institute on Saran, and had served the palace for 11 years without a serious error I had ever been required to log. He was thorough. He was learned. He ran a full physiological assessment on the young heir over 3 days. Blood panels, neurological mapping, sleep architecture scans, nutritional indices, and found nothing wrong with the boy's body that a bit of rest and regular meals would not correct. The cause, he concluded after a further 2 days of observation, was almost certainly psychological in origin. He prescribed a mild calming tincture taken before sleep, a reduction in the young heir's lesson schedule, and twice-weekly sessions with a court emotional counselor named Britha Sale, who had a gentle manner and an excellent professional reputation, and who, over the following 3 weeks, precisely no progress that I could detect. I am not being unfair to Britha Sale. She was skilled. She used methods that had worked with troubled children at the palace before. She created a careful, quiet space in which the young heir was invited to express whatever he might be feeling, and the young heir sat across from her and said that he felt fine, and then sat in the East Gallery afterward and stared at the mechanical cases with those wide, still eyes. In the 6th week, the Emperor called in a specialist. Her name was Doroth Vale, and she came from the Saran Institute with a formal credential in pediatric cognitive distress, a staff of 4 assistants, and a method she described in a preliminary briefing, which I attended, noting everything in the margins of my ledger. as a structured revelation protocol involving graduated trust exercises, symbolic object associations, children, the young hire's age, a particular form of guided imaginative narration designed to externalize internal emotional states through a neutral creative medium. I will not pretend I understood all of this. I wrote it down faithfully and trusted that it meant something. Dorothy Vale worked with the young here for 8 days. She was patient. She was professional. She introduced the symbolic objects, small carved figures, each representing a common childhood fear, arranged in a specific sequence the protocol dictated, and invited him to tell their stories. The young here told very polite, very brief stories about the figures, and then stopped talking and looked at the window. By the end of the 8th day, Dorothy Vale had determined that the young here was a child of unusual inner reserve, that standard externalization protocols were insufficient for his particular cognitive architecture, and that she recommended a longer course of treatment. Perhaps throughout 3 months, with a revised set of symbolic objects more specifically calibrated to his cultural context at developmental stage. The emperor thanked her, and she departed. We were now at 40 days since the young here had last slept properly. I will record because it is relevant to what follows, the atmosphere in the palace during those 40 days. It was as the atmosphere of a place where important people are trying very hard and achieving nothing, and where everyone is aware of both facts and no one is permitted to say either of them aloud. The emperor's composure held. The empress did too, though I noticed she was spending more time in the garden. The small one off the nursery wing, a place she went when she needed to be somewhere the court couldn't reach her. The senior staff moved carefully. Voices were kept down. The mechanical display cases in the East Gallery were wound and rewound twice a day by a junior attendant who had been told to make sure they were always running because the young here seemed to like watching them. I kept my ledger. I noted the entries. I did not speculate in the margins. Speculation is not my function, but I will confess that I had begun, in the privacy of my own thinking, to feel something I could only describe as a helpless bewilderment. We had the best physicians the empire could reach. We had a child who was plainly suffering from something, and the two facts refused to connect. I should explain, before I go further, the arrangement that existed at the time. Regarding the human medical officer, Dorothy IV had maintained a formal, diplomatic relationship with the human systems for 14 years at that point. Part of the arrangement, one of the smaller, more procedural parts, was a provision for the exchange of medical personnel for the purpose of building professional familiarity between human and Dorothy medical traditions, and partly, if I am being honest about the politics of it, as a gesture of goodwill that cost very little and could be pointed to as evidence of openness. The human assigned to us in the 42nd year of the emperor's reign was a general practitioner named Callum Bryce. I had encountered Dr. Bryce on perhaps a dozen occasions in the year and a half he had been at the palace, and I want to be precise about the nature of those encounters, because precision is what I owe the record. He was not a figure who commanded attention. He was a solidly built man in his middle 50s, close-cropped gray hair, and a manner so thoroughly undemonstrative that he seemed to occupy slightly less space than he actually did. He spoke carefully and without ornament. He did not bow as elaborately as palace custom expected, not because he was impertinent, but because, I gradually came to understand, he simply forgot to, and no one had told him clearly enough that it mattered. He ran a small medical annex in the East Service wing of the palace, a 2-room operation that existed primarily to handle the minor medical needs of the palace's service staff. Headaches, sprains, the occasional deep cut from kitchen work, seasonal respiratory complaints. He was, by the standards of the palace formal medical hierarchy, a peripheral figure, useful in the way that a reliable tool kept in a back drawer is useful, present, competent for its purpose, not expected to be relevant to anything important. It would not have occurred to me, in the 40 days before what happened, to involve him in the matter of the young here. In fairness, it would not have occurred to him either. He told me as much later in the flat way he told me most things. I didn't know what was going on, he has said. I knew something was off with the mood of the place, you couldn't miss that, but nobody mentioned the boy to me. It's not a complaint. It wasn't my area. He paused, because Callum Bryce was a man who paused between thoughts to make sure the thought was finished. I would have offered, if I'd known, he said. Though I don't know what I would have offered. I'm a GP, not a child specialist. This, I will come to believe, was exactly the point. But I am getting ahead of myself. The 41st day. The Empress was in her garden, the small one, off the nursery wing, which I mentioned earlier. It was mid-morning. The lesson attendants had collected the young here for his first lesson of the day, reduced schedule per Helvar Sen's earlier recommendation. But the young here had been in the antechamber when the attendants arrived and had given them the slip. Not maliciously, I am confident of that. He was not a child who was malicious, and had somehow navigated his way out of the nursery wing without anyone observing him do it. This was not as alarming as it sounds. The palace is secure. There was nowhere inside it that was genuinely dangerous, and the young here knew the grounds well. What it was, rather than alarming, was unusual. He was not a child who wandered. He was a child who sat in one place and thought hard. I learned later that the attendants had searched the nursery wing for 15 minutes before widening their search to the adjacent corridors, and that at no point in 15 minutes anyone thought to check the service areas, because children of the young here's position did not, in the normal way of things, go to the service areas. He went to the service areas. Specifically, he went to the small exterior garden that abutted the east annex, a narrow strip of ground between the annex wall and the outer service colonnade, planted with flat-leafed ground cover that the palace groundskeepers kept trimmed and largely ignored. It was not a decorative garden. It was not, really, a garden at all. It was simply a gap between two structures that had been given a layer of growing things to keep it from looking like a gap. There was a low stone wall along one side. There were no fountains, no ornamental plantings, no decorative benches. The light was indirect. It was, I suspect, precisely the sort of place a small boy who wanted to be nowhere could find. Dr. Bryce was in the habit of taking his mid-morning tea in that garden. I know this because I went back and asked him afterward, and he confirmed it with the patient precision he brought to all questions. Yes, most mornings, around the second hour. It was quiet. The light came in sideways so it wasn't harsh, and no one bothered him there. He was sitting on the low stone wall with his tea when the young here walked through the gap in the colonnade and stopped. I have reconstructed what followed from Bryce's account, which I recorded in a formal interview 3 days after the event, and from the account of a second-floor service attendant who happened to be near an upper window and observed part of the encounter, though she could not hear the conversation from that distance. The young hears stopped. Bryce looked up. Here is what Bryce did not do. He did not stand. He did not bow. He did not call for an attendant or express alarm at an imperial heir appearing unexpectedly in a service garden. He did not, as Bryce described it to me later, with a slight furrowing of the brow that was his version of sheepishness, quite know the proper protocol for that situation. And so he simply did not perform any protocol at all. He looked at the boy. The boy looked at him. I nodded, Bryce told me, like you'd nod at anyone. And then I looked back at my tea, because I didn't want to make lad feel watched. The young here did not leave. He stood at the edge of the garden for what Bryce estimated at 2 or 3 minutes. A long time, in the ways that silence in an unexpected place is long. And then he came and sat on the wall, not close to Bryce, at the other end, far enough that it was clearly its own choice. Its own position, not a request for company. Bryce drank his tea. The young here sat. How long did you sit like that? I asked him when I interviewed him. A while, he said. I wasn't counting. Long enough that my tea went cold. The service attendant at the upper window noted in her account that she had watched for perhaps 10 minutes before being called away by other duties, and that in those 10 minutes neither the man nor the boy had moved or spoken. She had thought it strange. She had not thought it worth reporting because she had not realized who the boy was. She knew him by his formal dress, and he was not in his formal dress that morning. At some point, Bryce approximated it. At perhaps 15 minutes into the silence, he said something to the boy. What did you say? I asked. He thought about it for a moment, making sure he had it right. What's the matter then? He said. That's all. Not a question, really. More of an observation. The way you'd say it to anyone who was sitting, looking as if something were the matter. He paused. I wasn't thinking about who he was, he looked like a boy with something weighing on him, and I'm a doctor. That tends to be the first thing I say. The young hare answered him. I want to be careful here, because what the young hare said is, in its way, the heart of this record, and I want to get it right. He didn't answer immediately. Bryce told me there was another long pause. The boy turned and looked at him, this stranger on the wall with a cup of cold tea, and seemed to be deciding something. And then he answered. He said, and Bryce recounted this carefully, because he had understood by then that it was important, that he had heard something. About 4 weeks earlier, the young hare had been passing through the corridor outside the Emperor's private study, after a lesson that had run long, and the study door had been slightly open. He had heard his father speaking with someone inside, one of the senior ministers, Bryce presumed, and he had heard a phrase. He was not certain he had heard it correctly. He had kept walking because he was not supposed to linger near the Emperor's private study. And he was a child who understood, in the particular way of children raised inside formal households, that there were things you were not supposed to hear, and that the correct response to hearing them was to unhear them as quickly as possible. But he couldn't unhear this one. What he thought he had heard was his father saying that he was dying. He had carried this for 4 weeks, by himself, because he was 7 years old and he was the young hero of Doroth IV, and he understood. In the same wordless way he understood a great many things. His position. That this was not something you cried about where anyone could see you do it. That you were composed. That you were still. That you sat in the East Gallery and watched the mechanical cases run and did not let anyone see how afraid you were. He had not asked. He had not told his mother. He had not mentioned it to Britha Sale or Doroth Vale or Helvar Sen or anyone, because there was, somewhere in his 7-year-old understanding of his world, a belief, not fully formed, not fully conscious, entirely real, that asking was the thing that made it true, that if he kept it inside and didn't speak it, it remained somehow deniable. He told all of this to Callum Bryce in a low, careful voice, sitting on the wall of a service garden, with his hands flat on the stone on either side. Him. And Callum Bryce sat and listened. I didn't say anything for a bit, Bryce told me afterward. I let him finish. He'd been holding on to it a long time, and he needed to get to the end of it. Then he asked the boy if he could tell him what his father had said, exactly as he could remember, word by word. The boy told him. It was possible, it is possible. I have since confirmed it. That what the young hare had overheard was a conversation about the political situation in the outer territories, where there was, at that time, a formal diplomatic phrase in use among the senior ministers that translates approximately as dying on the vine, meaning a negotiation or an alliance that was losing momentum and likely to fail. It was a phrase in common use. The minister who had been with the emperor that day confirmed when I quietly asked him weeks later that they had been discussing the Soran trade agreement, which had been stalling for 3 months, and that he believed he himself might have used that phrase. The young hare had heard his father say the word dying, through a gap in a door, and had filled in the rest with the worst thing a 7-year-old who loves his father could imagine. 4 weeks. He had carried it for 4 weeks. I told him, Bryce said, that his father wasn't ill. That I didn't think that was what his father had been talking about. And then, because I'm a physician and I try to be accurate, I told him that I couldn't know for certain what his father had said, but that I could find out, and that if he'd wait there for a few minutes, I would go and ask someone who would know. He looked at me across the table where I was conducting the interview. I went and found your assistant, he said. The young one, Davin. I told him I had a question that needed a quiet, fast answer, and that it was about the Emperor's health, and that if the answer was anything other than the Emperor is in perfect health, I needed to know immediately. Davin, my junior aide, I will be speaking to about this at the earliest opportunity, had confirmed that the Emperor was in excellent health, that there was no illness, that the word dying had almost certainly been diplomatic terminology relating to the trade talks. Bryce thanked him and went back to the garden. Told the boy, Bryce said. Straight out. His father was fine. Healthy. What he'd heard was about a political thing, not a health thing. I explained it as simply as I could. He picked up his cold tea, seemed to reconsider it, and put it back down. He didn't say anything for a bit, and then he cried. He said it with no elaboration and no commentary, in the flat, kind way he said most things, as though it were simply the next fact in the sequence. He cried for a while. I sat with him. When he was done, I found him a cloth for his face, and then I asked him if he'd eaten breakfast, and he said he hadn't. And I said we could probably find something in the annex kitchen if he didn't mind ordinary things, and he said he didn't mind. He took the young here inside. He made him a plate of whatever the annex kitchen had, bread, and a soft-cooked grain, as it turned out, some preserved fruit that was slightly past its ideal moment, but edible. The young here ate most of it. Then his lesson attendants found him. By then frantic 25 minutes into their search, and returned him to the nursery wing. Bryce went back to his annex and saw the rest of his morning's patients. He did not report the encounter to anyone that day. It didn't seem like mine to report, he said, when I asked why. He told me something in confidence, as near to confidence as a 7-year-old can get. It felt wrong to go shouting it around. He paused, also. I assumed he'd tell someone himself. He'd had a good cry and a meal and a proper explanation. I thought he'd feel better. He had felt better. That night, for the first time in 40 days, the young here slept through to morning. His attendants reported it to Helvar Sen, who reported it to the Empress, reported it to the Emperor, with a relief I can only estimate from the fact that I have never, before or since, seen the Emperor put his face in his hands. In the morning, the young here went to his lessons. In the afternoon, he asked, for the first time in weeks, if the display cases were wound. He ate his supper. The Emperor summoned Helvar Sen and asked him what had changed. Helvar Sen, to his very great credit, told the truth. He did not know. It was the Empress who found out by asking the young here directly, in the quiet of his bedchamber, with a patience and gentleness that I understand was considerable. She told me this herself, 3 days after the fact, in a conversation I was present for, because I am always present. She found her son sitting on his bed with the one-winged cloth skyrunner in his lap. She sat beside him. She asked if she could know what had happened. He told her. Not everything. Not the full weight of the 40 days, but enough. He told her about the garden and the man on the wall. He told her what he'd heard, and what he'd thought, and what the man had said. He told her he'd had bread and fruit in the annex kitchen, which had been plain but nice. She sat with him for a while after that. Then she came and found me. I am recording her exact words because they are precise, and I think they deserve to be preserved exactly. Find the human physician and make sure we have his correct name in the formal ledger. I'm going to need it. I found Callum Bryce in his annex 2 hours later. He was, as I had come to understand was usual for him in the late afternoon, finishing his notes from the day's cases. He had a writing system that was entirely manual. He wrote with a physical instrument on physical paper, which I had initially regarded as an eccentricity, and had since come to understand, was simply how he was most comfortable. The notes were neat. The handwriting was not elaborate. Everything was exactly as legible as it needed to be, and no more. I told him that the matter of the young here had been raised with the Empress, and that the Emperor would be requesting a formal meeting. Put his pen down and looked at me. Is the boy all right? He said. This was the first thing he said. I told him the boy was considerably better. He said. He picked up his pen. When's the meeting? I told him the day after tomorrow, in the East Reception Hall at the 2nd hour, and that the dress standard was formal civic. He looked at me with an expression that I had learned, over our various encounters, meant that he was attempting to calibrate how seriously to take something. I don't have formal civic, he said. I have my good coat. Told him his good coat would be acceptable, and made a note to send Davin to help him with the fastenings. The meeting was conducted in the East Reception Hall at the 2nd hour, 2 days later, as scheduled. I will not transcribe it in full. The formal proceedings are entered separately in the court record. But I will note several things that are relevant to this account. The first is that the Emperor stood when Bryce was brought in. This is not standard. The Emperor receives. He does not stand. Every person in the room noticed. I noted it in my ledger. The second is that the Emperor's formal address, which I had drafted on his behalf the previous day, In consultation with his senior private secretary and a ceremonial officer who advises on matters of intersystemic diplomatic recognition, used the phrase in the dead of the imperial house. This phrase has not, to my knowledge, been used formally since the reign of the previous emperor. I looked it up. It is not mild. The third thing is Callum Bryce's response. He stood in the East reception hall in his good coat, with Davin's assistance, having resolved the fastenings to a reasonable standard, and he listened to the emperor's formal address with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Complete, unhurried, unperformed. He waited until the emperor was finished. Then he said, in Dorath Common, which he spoke adequately, and with an accent I had once described, privately as structural, "He's a good boy, Your Majesty. I didn't do much. He did the hard part." The court was silent. The emperor looked at him for a moment with an expression, "I am not sure I have words for in any language I know." Then he said, in the same common Dorath, "What do you need?" I had not anticipated this. I do not believe the ceremonial officer had anticipated it either, because the formal script did not include it. The emperor, it seemed, had set aside the formal script. Bryce thought about it. The pause he brought to genuine thinking. "I have a lad with a dietary complaint in the morning," he said, "and an older woman from the laundry who's having trouble with her back. I'd like to get back to them by the 3rd hour, if that's reasonable." The silence in the East reception was the particular quality of silence that falls when an entire room has been presented with something that does not fit any category it was prepared for. The emperor, for the first time in that formal setting, did something I had not before seen him do in any formal setting. He smiled, not broadly. The emperor was not a man of broad expressions. It was real. I logged it. I will not pretend it did not affect me. What followed was a negotiation of the quiet variety, conducted not in the reception hall but in a smaller private room. In the company of the emperor, the empress, myself, and Callum Bryce. The emperor wished for Bryce to be installed as a senior medical officer of the palace. He wished this, partly because the young heir had apparently decided, with the particular certainty, that 7-year-olds reserve for important decisions, that he liked Dr. Bryce and intended to see him again, and partly, I believe, because the emperor is a man who values the useful thing correctly when he sees it clearly. Bryce listened to this. Then he explained his situation. He had patients in the annex. He had 6 members of the kitchen staff. He was watching for a seasonal respiratory complaint that had not yet resolved. He had the laundry woman's back, which was worse than she was admitting, and which he wanted to monitor for another 2 weeks before deciding whether to refer her. He had a maintenance worker with a developing problem in his right knee that needed weekly assessment. These were not important patients by any standard the palace's formal hierarchy recognized. They were people who would, if Bryce became a senior medical officer, be transferred to whatever general provision existed for service staff. And Bryce had looked at the provision that existed for service staff and did not want to transfer them to it. He said all of this plainly and without apology. The emperor listened. The empress listened. I wrote it down. There was a further discussion, in which the emperor made 2 proposals and Bryce declined them, politely but entirely, tanned. And I was aware that I was watching something slightly unprecedented in my 31 years at the Oriath Palace. Private citizen telling the Emperor of Dorath IV no, twice over the space of 10 minutes, without any visible anxiety about doing so. What they agreed upon in the end was this. Bryce would visit the palace's upper medical wing, the wing that served the imperial family and high court, 1 morning per week, for consultations as required. He would remain, as his primary function, the physician of the East Annex. His patients there would not be transferred. The palace's general provision for service staff would be reviewed. This was the emperor's concession. It was reviewed, and subsequently improved. And the cost of maintaining the annex at its current standard would be absorbed. Formal palace medical budget, rather than the peripheral diplomatic allocation it had previously been charged to. Said that was reasonable. He then asked if there was anything further, and when there was not, he shook the emperor's hand. This was a human greeting gesture, and the emperor accepted it without hesitation, which I noted in the margin of my ledger with the word remarkable. and went back to his annex for his afternoon patience. I remained behind to complete the formal record. The Empress, when Bryce had gone, looked at the chair where he had been sitting and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, to no one in particular." "He?" asked the boy. "What was the matter?" She said it the way you say a thing when you are only just understanding it. He sat down next to him and he asked what was the matter. I did not respond because I understood she was not speaking to me. I wrote it down anyway. It seemed important to have it in the record. I have since spoken with Callum Bryce on many occasions. The one morning a week arrangement has now been running for 3 years. And a chamberlain, who is always present, naturally accumulates conversations with the people who are regularly present. I want to put several things in this record that I consider relevant. He is, as I have said, a general practitioner. He trained in a human city I cannot pronounce correctly, and practiced there for 22 years before the exchange program brought him to Dorothy IV. Is not, in any conversation I have observed or participated in, claimed expertise in pediatric emotional medicine, or in interspecies psychology, or in any of the specialized disciplines that Helvar Sen and Dorothy Vale brought to the case of the young here. He is honest to the point of bluntness about what he does not know. He refers cases when they exceed his knowledge, and he does so without ego. What he is, I have come to understand, is a physician who listens, not in a technique, not in a method. I have watched him with patients, the service staff patients in the annex, and occasionally the more formal consultations in the upper wing. And what he does is simply wait. He asks a question, and then he waits for the whole answer, including the parts that come slowly, and including the long silences that are part of the answer too. He does not complete sentences. He does not redirect. He sits with the answer until it's finished, and then he thinks about it before he speaks. I asked him once if this was something he had been taught. He looked slightly puzzled by the question. "You have to listen," he said. "Otherwise, you're just guessing." I wrote that down too. I asked him what he had thought. In the garden, when the young here had sat down on the wall. "I thought he looked tired," Bryce said, "and a bit hunched. The way people look when they've been carrying something heavy." He thought about it, and I thought, well, he'll go when he wants to go. No point making a thing of it, so I just didn't. I asked if he had recognized the boy. "Not immediately," he said. "I'd seen him at a distance, at one of the formal occasions. But I hadn't made the connection straight away. He was just a boy sitting on a wall." He paused. "Does it matter? I don't know that I'd have done anything differently if I'd known." I told him, with professional honesty, that I suspected he wouldn't have. He nodded, not with pride. Bryce does not nod with pride, but with the simple acknowledgement of a fact that seemed to him self-evident. The young here is 10 years old now. He still visits the annex on the morning Bryce is there, approximately twice a month. He sits on the wall in the service garden if the weather allows, or on the bench at the annex waiting room if it does not. He reads, or he watches the groundskeepers work. He brings some mechanism from the East Gallery that he is attempting to understand and works at it with small, precise hands. He does not always speak to Bryce at length. Sometimes he asks questions about human physiology, which is a subject he has developed an interest in. Sometimes he tells Bryce something that happened at his lessons. Sometimes he sits and eats whatever the annex kitchen has, is often plain and sometimes slightly past its moment. And this does not seem to bother him. The cloth sky runner, the one with the missing wing and the abbreviated tail, is, I am told, still on his bedside shelf. I cannot confirm this personally as I do not enter the young here's bedchamber, but the Empress mentioned it in passing, in the context of remarking that he had refused to let the household replace it with a better one. The one-winged thing stays. I find this, if I am honest, more affecting than anything else in this account. I am a chamberlain. I am not paid to be affected. I put it in the record because it is true, and because the truth is the whole point. Last winter, the deep winter, when Dorothy IV's northern face turns and the light goes slant and thin, and the palace takes on a cold that the heating systems manage but never quite beat, the Emperor came to the East Annex, not formally, not with any notice that I had been given, which means either he deliberately excluded me from the preparation, which is his right, or he decided in the moment, which is more in keeping with the Emperor's character, than people who do not know him well tend to credit. He came alone. He walked through the service colonnade in a plain coat and found Bryce at the end of his morning and asked if there was somewhere they could talk, without it being a matter of record. Bryce looked at him for a moment. Then he poured 2 cups of tea from the pot he kept on the small shelf in his office and handed one to the Emperor, and sat in one of the 2 chairs and gestured at the other. I know all of this because I was not there, and because, afterward, when I quietly asked Davin, who had followed the Emperor at a discreet distance and had been waiting in the corridor, Davin confirmed what he had observed through the annex office window. 2 men, sitting in 2 chairs, both holding tea, talking for approximately half an hour. He could not hear the conversation. I did not ask Bryce what they had talked about. It was not mine to ask. But I will say that when I saw the Emperor the following morning at the day's first formal briefing, he had the look of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a while, and who is not certain yet whether to be relieved or only slightly lighter. I know that look. I have seen it before. I have seen it on a 7-year-old boy in a service garden after a long silence and a plain question and a plate of ordinary food. I put it in the record. I do not explain it. It is not the Chamberlain's job to explain. It is the Chamberlain's job to notice and to write it down accurately and to trust that the truth, plainly stated, is enough. Here it is then, plainly stated. Every healer in the Empire came and tried what they knew, and the boy remained in his silence. A man in a good coat sat on a wall with cold tea and asked a boy what was the matter, and waited for the answer. The boy told him, "That is all that happened. It is enough."